Hi, my name is Courtney Teshuden, and I'm an elementary and special education major. My theme for my competency statement is teaching diverse learners. My competency statement is I am competent in using multiple teaching strategies to engage students of all abilities, so each is given an opportunity to succeed. Some of the main points that I have going on with my capstone are teaching strategies are used to engage students of all abilities, and then building relationships are key to knowing what those strategies are, as well as accommodating those children and then gearing towards their academic and their social goals. So my first piece of evidence comes from my math block, where I was in a class called SPED 303, Behavior Management. We were instructed to pick a student that would benefit from behavior management or positive reinforcement. And as you can see, I chose a student who is Peyton in a 5th grade classroom at Roper Elementary. He spent a lot of his time in the general education classroom, and his teacher said the main concern for Peyton is his participation, his listening skills, and his self-confidence. And so what I did is I took this course and I put it into my math block, and I built a chart, a movement chart that was geared towards Peyton, so his interests were included. And then when I was teaching, I would have Peyton raise his hand and ask a question. He had a lot of trouble where he was blurting out and he wasn't able to contain that excitement that he had, and so he would just blurt out without raising his hand and waiting for that instruction from me. That was not helping his academic success because he was blurting out and then the teacher would remove him from the classroom, and so he was really struggling in that. So what I knew was I knew how to take that data on that student. I knew how to create a movement chart, as well as using something that he really was interested in, as you can see on his board. But what I lacked is different teaching strategies. All I knew is, Peyton, you need to raise your hand when you want to be called on. That was the only teaching strategy that I used when teaching those that math lesson. I didn't say, everyone, please write the answer on a sticky note or talk to your elbow partner. There wasn't a lot of engagement for the students. So I didn't accommodate or differentiate for Peyton in any sort of way. I didn't know how to do that yet, and so I didn't even model the behavior of please raise your hand, wait to be called on, and then bring it back down. That was never something that I knew how to do. So the culture of the classroom really could have been more engaging and more interactive for those students, especially for Peyton. My second piece of evidence comes from my literature block, where we had two main projects that we did. The first one was our case study, and I chose a student, Blaine, who was a kindergartner at Cooser Elementary. And I chose this student because I knew that Blaine was having a lot of difficulties writing his name, letter recognition, sight words, and his seat work. I wanted to look deeper into why he was having these difficulties, so I used different teaching strategies and I accommodated for Blaine after knowing and building that relationship with him, knowing what he liked and what he didn't like. So as you can see, I accommodated for Blaine in using multiple ways, such as using the alphabet at his chart, as well as the sight words, so that he was able to see, I want to write a cat likes to eat food. Or I highlighted his work. I used iPad games, so tracing letters, so he really engaged with what he was learning. I did Capstone, so he was able to self-regulate. I modeled all of his expectations for him. I was able to say, if you do this with me, Blaine, for 5 minutes, you then get a 5-minute break of whatever you want to do. I turtle talked with him, so I talked and sounded out each word so that he was able to break down each letter. And then I had a lot of actions and songs for the sight words that I did with the students. So for example, with the, he remembered the because I said T-H-E, the. As you can see, using these accommodations and the teaching strategies that I did, He came into the kindergarten classroom not really knowing his letters and his sounds, but by the end, after those accommodations were made, Blaine did very successful and was still growing after I had left him at December. The other piece of literature block, as I mentioned, that was the case study. The other one was our thematic unit, which mine was all about culture. And I had spent some time in Africa. I was there for 6 months, so I brought some things in from Africa that I wanted to show the students. And so we talked about the similarities and differences between African culture, their clothing, the head wrap that women wear, the transportation, the housing, and then some of the songs. And so I worked with Blaine and the other students in his class, and we talked about the similarities and differences between their culture. And so what we got to do is we made a book, and it said all about culture, and Blaine was able to write his name successfully. When he talked about what his favorite food for breakfast was, he said waffles. And I said, okay, well, let's sound that out on your arm. And so he was able to use Turtle Talk as one of the teaching strategies to sound out waffles. He then drew a picture of his house. He wanted to say that his language was English, and I said, well, how do you say hello in English? He said, oh, it's, I want to write that down. So I was able to highlight, and then he was able to trace that. One of his favorite piece of clothing is his football jersey, and so I modeled that and showed him, okay, well, this is how you write football jersey, and then he was able to trace it. He then went up in front of the entire class and was so excited that he shared his All About Culture book and was able to verbalize to the students. So that was very successful for him. What I still needed to learn and reflect on in this piece of evidence was I was missing the different content areas. So how do I accommodate Blaine using these different strategies in science? Or how do I do that within social studies? I only knew how to do this within the literature block. Another thing that I didn't realize is the language, that when we were learning about that in class, I was like, how does that all work? Like, why am I doing songs with these sight words? Why am I blending and segmenting these words on my arm? That doesn't even make sense to me. And so the vocabulary then came later on in my student teaching, knowing that there's phonemic awareness and segmenting and blending, and it all works together. It's why you use songs to help kids remember a certain sight word. It really, really connects with them. My third piece of evidence comes from my student teaching, where I had an 8-week experience in the kindergarten classroom, an 8-week in ACP, which is Alternative Curriculum Program within a special education classroom. This piece of evidence comes from being in the kindergarten classroom, where after all of my lessons, we reviewed the numbers 1 through 5 in math. I first had the students come to the floor, and we read through The Very Hungry Caterpillar. We did like a reader's theater, so we talked about what words they were going to hear. They were going to hear some numbers. Let's review those numbers before we get into the book. When I opened the book, I had each student, if they heard the number, put their hand on their heart. I said, the caterpillar ate 5 oranges, so we flapped our wings and did the number 5, so we flapped it 5 times. They then showed me 5 on their hand and flashed me 5. We counted on our hands. We wrote the word 5 on our arm, so it was all teaching strategies that I used on the floor. So then when we went back to our seat, I had this made for each student, and I modeled this while they were doing it. And so we talked about writing out the word 1, or writing the word 1 and then corresponding with the fruit that the caterpillar had ate. So we talked about, and this again was a reviewed lesson, but for 2, I had them say different songs for the number, or we talked about 2 being that a T begins with the word 2, and then they did their corresponding fruit and the color that it talked about within the story. This is a student who has an IEP who successfully was able to do it when I modeled. I was using the strategies again, saying like 1 is fun, and he was able to do that at his seat on his own, and then he drew the corresponding fruit and matching with the color that we heard in the story. My principal at the time observed this lesson, so the highlighted parts are, and this is all things that she had seen me do as a teacher and using different teaching strategies. So for example, she loved that when I did my academic vocabulary, I was doing the actions with the words. So I was saying, okay, show me greater than, which number is greater than 5? And so then we were talking about greater than as opening our arms and being bigger, and then doing hands that were really small and saying less than. We got to talk about, that vocabulary, and them doing the actions really helped them to know which one was which. And then, for example, she has 5 on your hands, or put 2 TWO on your arm and sound that out. I said, show me 10 on your hands, so flash me your 10s. And then after we were done, we got to stand up behind our chair and then count all of our numbers. And that was very successful for students both with an IEP and then just in the general education classroom. What I still needed to learn from this is how to put all of those strategies together and make it more comfortable in an environment. Have them learn, it's okay to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes. And so just constantly building that rapport with my students. So what I still need to learn is that, or what I learned is that no 2 students are the same. They all have different backgrounds and cultures that they come from. They all have different needs and learning styles. And so I was able to create meaningful relationship with the students to know which teaching strategy works for them and which doesn't. And so then I was also able to be very flexible. If something didn't work for one student, I would try something else. And so then last, I said that celebrating all successes is very, very important, because the littlest ones, they get so excited that they can do it. So you should always be celebrating just those little things. What I still need to learn is how to create different ways of accommodation. So going into the future, I'm more than likely not going to have a student with a disability that I had experience with. So I'm going to need to educate myself in order to understand, where they're coming from, what can they do, what can I help them that would make them more successful for both their academic and social goal. And I think by doing this, the co-teachers that I'm working with, as well as the students, they're going to be able to teach me that. How do I identify with what I still need to learn? Is that I just need to be flexible and work with each student and meet that student's need and know, this will work really well with this student. And if it doesn't work well, I will take time and reflection to know, okay, what happened that went wrong? Then I can move forward in knowing exactly, what happened and what worked for that student, so that they can be really successful in the end. And talking to my colleagues about, hey, I have a student and this didn't work. How could I help them to moving forward in math? What would you suggest doing? And the students will definitely help me out with that. So, and overall, I would like to work on my better explicit instruction, as well as my teaching strategies in general.